Anyway, I just want to say this. I thank you for your service, because the boards and commissions are the building blocks of our municipal government in Colorado. You serve the elected officials and the community and the staff of your cities and towns well, because you're the first ones to really study and analyze issues and challenges coming before your communities, and that builds a foundation for decision-making, better decision-making moving forward when it finally gets up to the council or the town board, or in the case of one municipality, our Board of Selectmen. I certainly want to acknowledge Georgetown. And so it's extremely important, the work that you do, and we thank you for that. And hopefully today you'll get a little basic understanding of the fundamentals of boards and commission work. Every community in this state has a whole variety of these things. We often think of the planning commissions or the liquor licensing authorities, but just from what we've heard this morning, there's just a whole range of other advisory boards that serve municipalities in a variety of ways. So I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate you being here today. And with that, I want to turn it over to Gary Suter and have him talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. But again, thank you very much. So, Gary, take it away. Oh, I'm going to give it to Lisa. There you go.
All right. It's my pleasure to introduce Gary Suter. Gary has a distinguished career of over 30 years serving in chief executive positions of several local governments in Colorado, which included city, county, airport, and emergency preparedness management positions in rural, urban, and resort communities. Since starting his own consulting firm in 2002, he has assisted many municipalities and organizations throughout the Rocky Mountain West with strategic planning, group retreats, executive recruitment, major land use applications, annexations, organizational analysis, and performance measurement. He affiliated with the Mercer Group in 2010 and is conducting executive searches and organizational analysis for local governments in the western U.S. He is a recognized leader in local government management profession and has served as president of the board of the Colorado City and County Management Association, as well as many other accomplishments. You are in great hands for the next hour, so please help me welcome Gary Suter.
Thanks and welcome to all of you. I'd like to keep this interactive, so as I go through my slides, this is a 101 presentation, so it was good to see all the first-timers here, so I think we have a good program for a good target audience. And if you have questions as we go through, just pop your hand up and we'll have that dialogue. If I feel like I'm getting behind, we'll speed things up and get through a couple of slides, but I do like to keep it interactive in case you have questions. So. First off, I want to thank you for what you do. I want to echo what Sam said. I know you guys are all in highly compensated positions. And so, and I know you're serving your communities because you care. And it's an important thing, and it is a foundation, a building block. I can't tell you the number of people that come through the boards and commissions and then end up serving on city councils and boards of trustees. So thank you for what you do. And also just wanted to plug the Colorado Municipal League, a great organization. It is the one organization, I spent many years in city management, the one organization that it was just a no-brainer every year to pay your dues to the Colorado Municipal League. Without a doubt, the best value of any of the nonprofits or other agencies that are supported, the local COGs and so forth and so on, not taken away from them, but it's always a no-brainer with the Colorado Municipal League. So, since a lot of you are new, Lisa said it, but I'm gonna ask you again. Do you remember what she said about what CML does? It's kind of 3 words, and I remember it. Advocacy, right? They are out there and they're on Capitol Hill and advocating for municipal interests. And if you look at their track record, it's an incredible track record. Information. Great information source. If you ever have questions, you can always call the league. There'll be somebody here that can help you out. And then last but not least, training. So here we are. You're getting one of those 3 planks of the Colorado Municipal League. Advocacy, information, training. Remember that. And their tagline, does anybody know their tagline? You may not. Lisa does. It's the voice of Colorado's cities and towns. If there's just two things to remember about CML, advocacy, information, training, the voice of Colorado's cities and towns. So it's a great organization, and honored to be here with all of you. So today, we're gonna be talking about boards and commissions basics, roles and responsibilities. I do a lot of facilitations with city councils and boards of trustees and other local government boards. And one of the most common complaints that I get is confusion of roles. So I will call up city councilors, board members, and say, well, what do you want to talk about? I say, well, there's confusion of roles. And oftentimes it's roles of the governing board, the policymakers, the staff, what the staff is doing, and oftentimes the advisory boards. So we'll be covering that, and we'll talk about that and have some dialogue about that. So we're going to start with the authority. It's important to know, where's the authority derived that created your board or commission? They come from various sources. State statutes, for example, require planning commissions in statutory, and you'll see it often in home rule charters, where home rule charters form planning commissions, financial advisory boards. Oftentimes, many boards are formed by ordinances or resolutions. So it's important to know what was the authority, where is the authority derived that created your board or commission? And if you find that, it will tell you who you are and what your purpose is. And without purpose, without clarity of purpose, there's a good chance you're going to end up off on some other path. So it's really important to know who you are and why you're there, what your purpose is. So state statutes define planning commission's roles. Home rule charters define that. I worked for a town, a smaller resort town, that had a financial advisory board that was in the home rule charter. So that board ain't going nowhere. It's going to be around forever, and because nobody's going to be amending the charter, dissolving the financial advisory board. And they were a valuable board. When we presented budgets to them, they would go out, they'd get educated, and they'd become our emissaries in the community to say, I've seen the budget, and it's good, and the staff listened to our input. So know your authority. Boards or commissions can be permanent or ad hoc. I've seen commissions formed, for example, to oversee construction of a recreation center. So you get funding, bond issue passes, you get funding for a rec center, and the council will say, let's form this building oversight committee or commission. You guys oversee this, provide reports to the council or the board, et cetera. It's important to know whether your board is advisory or decision-making. I can't emphasize that enough. Obviously, if advisory is in your title, you should take that seriously. So it's an important thing, an important distinction. Decision-making boards, examples of those typically include liquor licensing authorities, because and I saw a few hands go up. Anybody here on liquor boards? Yes, saw one over here. Typically, when you make a decision, you're granting that liquor license to the applicant, and that is decision-making and can be a final decision on whether they receive or that license is denied. And it's a big responsibility. I see sometimes zoning boards of appeals have decision-making authority. So, and building code boards of appeals, sometimes those have final decision-making authority, but it's important to know that distinction and that clarification. Your enabling authority will determine whether the board is advisory or decision-making. Any questions at this point? Okay, we'll keep rolling. Check the enabling legislation to determine the extent or limits of your policy-making and decision-making authority. And it's also important to clarify the expectations from your city or town council or board of trustees. So as I said, oftentimes one of the biggest complaints I receive both from boards and commissions are expectations aren't clear. And it's very important to have clear expectations. The most common example I've seen is when there's growth. So go pre-2008. Now it's starting to happen again. So there was a dead zone in there where this conflict didn't arise much. But if you had a city council or a board of trustees that say was pro-growth, or let me flip that around. They say they were anti-growth. So they were passing policy issues that were designed to make the growth process more difficult, to exact more from the developers, from the applicants, and so forth. But you had a planning commission that was more pro-growth. Usually not a very good scenario. So it was very important to have those discussions between your board of trustees and the planning commission, for example, to make sure that those expectations were clear. And I've helped facilitate some of those before, where you get the council and the planning commission in the same room and say, hey, you know, what's our enabling authority? What's your job? What's our job? Let's clarify roles and clarify expectations. I've also seen some city councils, if they didn't like the direction that the planning commission was going, as those terms lapsed, they appointed people that were more in line with their own philosophy. And then the electorate would come in and toss out all the city council members of the board of trustees and go the other direction. So it can be like a pendulum sometimes. And you know, it's a dynamic feature of local government. It's really kind of what makes it interesting and sometimes fun. So to learn how to navigate and roll with those waves. So again, in terms of powers and duties, know your board or your board of trustees or your city council's philosophy and know what they expect from you. And this is very important. If it's unclear, see if you can schedule a joint meeting to clarify those expectations. So important, because oftentimes I see board members get appointed, commission members get appointed, city council appoints you, congratulations, you're on the board, and then you're just put in the lifeboat and set adrift. And it's really important to have clarification as to what those expectations are. And if you and your board are talking about that and saying, what the heck does our board want? What the heck does the city council want? You know, make that request. Have your chair go to a meeting, get on the agenda and say, you know, we're really not sure what you're expecting from us as a board. And we just would like to have that discussion. And I always advise boards of trustees and city council members to attend the planning commission meeting or the board meeting, the advisory board meeting, on their night, on their turf, basically. It shows respect, and it's a lot less intimidating rather than the board or commission. Like I said, you guys are all highly compensated in your positions, and coming in and sitting at a regular city council meeting or board of trustees meeting and having them look down the dais at you and tell you, well, this is how it's going to be. So I always advise the city council's board of trustees, go to the board or commission meeting and talk to them on their terms in their meeting with their decorum and have that discussion. So again, very important to clarify expectations. Very common problem where boards or commissions are just appointed and set adrift. So have that discussion. Take the affirmative if you need to, and schedule that, request the scheduling of that meeting. Here's some examples of boards or commissions. Of course, we talked about planning commission, DRBs, design review boards. Sometimes those have decision-making authority. Sometimes they're just advisory, so make sure you're clear on what that is. Transportation commissions, financial advisory boards, arts advisory boards. I think we had one of those long titles in here. Was it Parks, Recreation, Trails, Open Space, Libraries, and Cemeteries? Right. Don't want to forget. Liquor licensing authorities, typically those, because they're authority, and typically if you check your enabling legislation, typically they're decision-making. Boards of appeals, those can be decision-making as well. Building code, zoning board of appeals, zoning boards of adjustments. Sometimes those are final, sometimes they're not. So it's very important to check your enabling legislation. From where do you derive that power, and what are the limitations of that power? So that is a little bit about the authority that forms your board or commission. So make sure you're clear on that, and make sure your expectations are clear with your city council or board of trustees. So let's talk about policy. Policy, this is the most common definition, and I go back and I check, you Google policy in the internet, and there's all these definitions that pop up from Wikipedia on down to all this policy governance and policy institutes and so forth. But this is the most common one: a course of principle of action a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual. So obviously, we're working for the local government, and it's supported by an expression of values, perspectives, or principles, and I'll add to that, or beliefs. So when you're talking about policy, and you think about the word, it comes from, there's lots of derivatives of it. Policy, police, politician, metropolitan, polis, which is the old Greek term for city-state, polis, and I'm not talking about Gerald. So, but polis, yeah, it was, so when you look at that, it's all a derivative of policy, and it all talks about the principle of action or a course adopted by a government supported by an expression of values, perspectives, or principles. So that's the definition of policy. And again, when you talk about roles, it's important to know what your role is in the formation of that policy. And believe me, you do have a role in the formation of policy in your local government. So let's start, and I'm going to use the term council. I use the term council and board of trustees interchangeably. So I might say council, I might say board of trustees. So cities and towns, interchangeable. The council's role is they're the policy makers. They are elected to represent their constituencies and establish that policy. They represent the people, obviously, and they lay the future course for the municipality. A very important role. They are the policy makers. It's important that council know the difference between policy and administrative issues. Now, I call this the what versus the how. The policy is the what, administration is the how. So now I'm delving in a little bit into the staff roles as well. Obviously, the council should work in the best interest of the community. Actually, everybody should be working in the best interest of the community, and that includes council members, trustees, commission members, as well as staff. Doesn't always happen that way. Occasionally, you'll see the self-interest or the ex parte communication, as Sam had talked about, to try and drive a deal or persuade something to go in a certain direction, and that's where you get into troubled waters. The council should be staying focused on the policy issues. And they also appoint members to boards and commissions. So were all of you appointed by a board of trustees or city council? Any exceptions to that? Okay, great. The council needs to stay focused on the policy. That is the what. So I always told my council members, when you start to talk about the how, then you're getting into the staff arena. The council sets the policy, they're the what. The staff, they are the technicians. They're the administrative technicians. They're the ones that deliver the services at the service delivery level. So when I had council members talking about how to pave a street, or how to catch the dogs, or how to catch the burglar, or so forth, it's like, well, no, I have a chief of police for that, and I have a street superintendent for that, and we need to trust the staff to do their jobs. If they're not doing the job, then we have more things to talk about. Now, specific to you, boards and commissions roles. Advisory boards and commissions, they gather information and make recommendations, provide advice to the policy-making body. So your advice typically goes up. If you are an advisory board, goes up to the policy-making board, which is the city council or the board of trustees. And I said this earlier, advisory boards and staff can positively influence the formation of policy. So don't think that your recommendations or your advice falls on deaf ears, even though I know one of the common complaints I hear from planning commissioners is that we went through all of this brain damage to go through this development review process. We gave it to council, and and then they ignored us, and they went this direction. And I will tell you that is also a part of the cycle of local governance, and it's something to be expected. We certainly as staff members had to deal with that all the time. I always felt like if I got a city council or a board to follow 60% of my recommendations, if I was batting 600, I felt like I was doing pretty good. But we could take an issue, look at it objectively, talk to all the subject matter experts on the staff, streets, police, parks, clerk, whoever else was out there, make a recommendation to council, which was totally objective and totally logical, and then it'd go up to the city council to the boardroom, and you'd put 20 citizens in there, and it would change the entire dynamic, and you'd come up with a result that was totally different. And that happens a lot. So it's really a part of our job. So we learn to accept that as staff members and as board and commission members. That's part of the waves that you need to ride as you provide your services to your advice to your city council or board of trustees. It can be frustrating. I've heard from planning commission members that go, we go through all this brain damage and then they ignore us. But again, it is a part of the reality of the democratic process. You put people in a room with a board of trustees and a city council, and especially if they're angry citizens, and it can affect the whole dynamic of the outcome of that. And sometimes it's just pure politics, especially I work a lot on the Western Slope and a lot of the small towns. Everybody knows everybody else. And it can be, you have a variance going before a planning commission or board of adjustment, and the local neighbors up there and saying, well, George did it down the street and Frank did it across the street and blah, blah, blah. And no, I did not impose this hardship upon myself. For those of you that are on planning commission, you know what I'm talking about. And, even though everybody looks and go, well, you did impose it upon yourself. You're the one that built the fence and paved the driveway and blah, 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 blah. But then they go, well, it's approved. Go ahead. So I'm always of the philosophy that 2 wrongs, 3 wrongs, 4 wrongs don't make a right. And it's important that these boards and commissions stand up and interpret the laws as you see fit and deliver those decisions. If they get overturned, well, that's on the council's watch. That's on the board's watch. And that can be frustrating, but it is part of the reality in serving on these advisory boards and commissions. The way you can positively influence the formation of policy is often city councils, boards of trustees give you assignments and ask you, give you assignment, for example, on planning commission and say, determine our urban growth boundaries, for example. And you get the staff, you go out there and you do all the research, so forth and so on. Well, your advice, your research is something that's going to go back up to the city council or the board, and they're going to take a look at that, and they're going to seriously consider that. Same thing with staff. When we get a directive from the council that says, go out and research an ordinance, well, the one that is a good example came up in my hometown of Carbondale. Research what people are doing to keep cats on leashes. Okay, so yeah, this was great. This was great media fodder. And what happened was somebody from the Audubon Society said the cats are killing all the songbirds. And so, of course, the city council, and yes, it does happen. And I live up in the mountains, and you see that, and there are feral cats and everything else, but they wanted to keep control of the cats. So what are the cat leash laws? So, of course, Citizens Committee was formed to research this and provide information back to the council. And it went on for several months, and eventually they got all the stakeholders together, and everybody discussed it, and came back to the council, made a recommendation, and I think the council, they did take some action. I'm not sure what it was. They might have modified their animal control ordinance to some extent. But it was that advisory board that came back and said, you know what, I don't think you're going to keep cats on leashes. So, but they did have, I think they did pass a law that said you had to have some control of your cat. You couldn't let it just run around and terrorize and kill the songbirds and terrorize the neighbors and so forth and so on. But cats do eat birds, so it's part of the wildlife cycle. So do we have any examples out there? Do you all have any examples of where you were given an assignment by your council or board to develop a policy issue or research a policy issue? I'm sure there are. Boards and commissions roles. Advisory boards and commissions roles are just that, generally advisory. We talked about that. Some boards have decision-making authority, usually liquor licensing, zoning board of adjustment, board of appeals. Which type do you serve? So let me see a show of hands. How many of you sit on a board where you do have decision-making authority? Yeah, see, there's about a third of you out there. And what's your board again, sir? Building Board of Appeals, liquor licensing, Planning and zoning, yes, have some decision making. And back here, same thing. Yeah, liquor licensing. So there you go. Know which type of board you serve and whether you have advisory or decision making authority. Let me talk a little bit about staff's role. All of your boards should have some level of staff support. And I think I heard, you ladies in the back, are you staffers? Yeah, so that's perfect example. So you're providing staff support to your boards and commissions. And you should have some level of staff support. It's something that is really required if you're going to be effective. You should have somebody, and this is all the legal stuff, and if I get legal questions later, I'll be bouncing those to Jeff Wilson, who's going to be the last presenter. But your meetings have to be open meetings under Colorado open meetings law. You should have somebody taking minutes or recording them, doing all that stuff to make sure that your meetings are legal and compliant with law. Staff members typically do that. They also perform the research, they provide information and support to advisory boards and commissions, as well as councils and trustees. I've always said that as a city manager, town manager, my job was primarily a purveyor of objective information. So our job was to go out and generate as objective information as possible, inform our boards and commissions, as well as our councils and boards of trustees with as complete information, as objective information as possible, so that they could see all sides of an issue and make a decision in the best interest of their community. And you remember how we talked about that. Got to be representing the best interest of your community. Staff members should stay objective. I've seen some staff members, especially planners, I came from a planning background, so I can say this, that would get political. And they go, well, I'm going to do whatever I can to kill this development. It's not the right thing, and I hate this developer anyway. Those staff members usually end up getting fired. You don't stick around very long. It's very important staff members stay objective when providing information to you. Staff also implements and enforces policy decisions of the council and the trustees. So the council sets the policy, the staff implements the policy. The boards and commissions can influence that policy by providing recommendations that go back up to the council level. And there's a diagram that kind of shows how that works. See if I got a laser pointer here. Yeah, so here you go. Council, BOT, Board of Trustees, they are the policy-making, appointing authority. They communicate their expectations to the board and commission. We talked about that. Make sure those expectations are clear so you know what your role is or what their philosophy is. We talked about in policy, it's a principle or course of action. Well, know what those principles are. You should know what those value systems are. That's really what I expect from my elected officials. And I've worked for boards that were ultra conservative and boards that were screaming liberal and everything in between. But I really didn't care as a professional. They were the elected officials, and it was their job to set that policy and dictate that policy to the staff. And our job was to implement that, as long as it was, as a colleague of mine said, as long as it was legal, moral, ethical, and non-fattening. But seriously, legal, moral, ethical. If it was legal, moral, ethical, and it passed all those tests, and your lawyer was saying, well, yeah, they can do this, it's fine. We had to carry it out. We had to carry it out with a smile on our face and make the city look good and make the city council and the board of trustees look good. So that was our job as staff. Board or commission, which is generally advisory, but there's also decision-making in there. Staff provides the research, support, and recommendations. So there's your support right there to your board or commission. And I'm sure those of you that are planning commissions, I mean, hands down, you have the biggest packets. I mean, your liquor licensing gets a lot of stuff too because you have a lot of background information in there. But some of these development reviews are so complex. Your land use regulations are so complex that staff provides you with a ton of information. You have a lot of reading to do, and it really can make the council and trustees' decision easier when you do your job and kind of vet these development reviews, these development applications. These recommendations from the staff to the board or commission then flow back up to the council or BOT, and they make the policy decision. So I'm doing an interim city management job in Steamboat Springs right now. Was at a council meeting last night, And it was very interesting. So this is the fun part of watching all this. There was a variance that came before the board. And the Planning Commission, and I will tell you, they have a great Planning Commission in Steamboat, and the City Council almost always goes with the Planning Commission recommendation. And this is the history of Steamboat Springs. I've known them for a long time, and the council pays a lot of attention to their Planning Commission. Last night, and it's probably going to be in the paper today, in the Steamboat Pilot, there was a variance that came before the board, and the Planning Commission recommended denial. And basically it was, you created this hardship yourself, and that's usually one of the criterion when you're granting a variance. Well, you can't create the hardship yourself. You can't build a fence and then say you can't see, for example. So, those are pretty simplistic examples, but the City Council got it. They considered all of the, and there was testimony. Citizens came in on both sides, and neighbors came in, and the applicant came in, and everybody provided the testimony. And council overturned the Planning Commission recommendation of denial. So they went ahead and approved the variance. So, but they all qualified that, and they all said, we almost always listen to our Planning Commission. You guys do a great job, but in this case, we're going to reverse the decision, and they granted the variance. How much of that was politics? I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm fairly new there doing this interim city management job, but it was just interesting to watch the dynamic go on, and the council trying to compliment the Planning Commission, but at the same time, but we're not going to go with your recommendation. So the variance was approved. But again, and if that was a continuing problem where your recommendations are continually getting rejected by the City Council, then I'd go back and I'd say, hey, this isn't quite working well. Let's schedule a work session and talk about expectations and talk about policy, and let's get some clarification on that. Responsibilities. Most of you know this stuff. I mean, when you're serving in these positions and you're dedicated public officials, you're there for the right reason. Most people run because they want a better community. They want to make their communities better. They want to make society more orderly and more safe, and health, safety, welfare, and all that good stuff. Occasionally you'll see somebody that's going to run because, by golly, I'm going to get that street paved or that variance approved if I got to run for city council and do that. But that's the exception, not the case. Individual board member works in the best interest of the community versus an agenda for personal gain. And usually when there's personal gain, it's pretty obvious. People see that. People know that. And in smaller communities, there's usually more of an opportunity for conflicts of interest. And Jeff Wilson will talk about some of that. Individual board member does their homework. Read your packets. And also stand for your core beliefs. And like I said, I worked for all types of political boards with all types of political beliefs. I really didn't care what they were as long as they stood up for something and as long as I could read them and they were predictable. So if I had, in the early 2000s, we started to see more of an environmental movement. You saw more what were called greenies get elected to city councils and boards of trustees. And so when that started to happen, I always put some sort of environmental option in there for them so that they could see that and promote that and see if it got traction. And in some cities, particularly on the Western Slope, it did get quite a bit of traction, particularly out in the oil shale country. So standing for their core beliefs, very important. In terms of your own dynamics on your own board, very important. Demonstrate respect to your other board and commission members, staff, the public, et cetera. I always tell city councils and boards, when you're holding these meetings, the chair is really the one that controls the decorum of the chambers, of the room. And if somebody's getting out of line, use the gavel and gavel them and say, I'm sorry, our rules here are respect, civility. We don't allow personal attacks, whatever rules you come up with. This is probably the most important skill set for elected and appointed officials, is willing to engage in meaningful debate and can agree to disagree. And I've seen council members and board members that just cannot lose without sour grapes. And they'll take it home and they'll stew over it and they'll run to the media and they'll say things that are disparaging to their fellow board members. And then they'll come back at the next meeting and it's like, I'm going to get that son of a whatever, and I'm going to vote against everything that he or she does. And it just drives the effectiveness of the board right down to the basement. So it's really important to be able to know how to engage in meaningful debate and just agree to disagree. I mean, if you're in this business, bless you, if you're in this business and you can't, I mean, it's going to be win some, lose some. You're all on decision-making models that are majority vote. And if you can't handle ending up on the short end of the vote from time to time, you're not going to last very long in this business, because it's the decision-making model that you're in and that you're kind of stuck with. So you're going to win some and lose some, and that's how we were as staff too. We could make our recommendations. Sometimes councils would adopt them, and we go yes. And other times they'd go a completely different direction, and we'd say, okay, now it's time to make them look good and deliver what they want. Very important skill sets: respect, civility, agree to disagree. Follow meeting protocol and ground rules. Stay focused on the discussion. Support the chair and help him or her with their job. So I see this with other board members too. Sometimes you're at a table or a council dais or a board dais, and you might have a system where you raise your hand. And sometimes when you're a chair of a meeting, you got to not only pay attention to the proceedings of what's going on and make sure you're being fair and in your deliberations, but you need to keep an eye on the process as well. So oftentimes I've seen board members go, oh, well, Sherry at the end of the table has her hand up, or there's a person that had their hand up in the audience, and the board may not see that person. So you can work as a team to help make your meetings more effective and efficient. Staying focused on the discussion, that's also part of the chair's job. There's always going to be what I call the rabbit trails, where you go down these sideline discussions, but it's really, and that can add hours to a meeting if it's not managed in some form. So, you know, if you don't have rules and of protocol and meeting decorum, schedule a work session for your board or commission and figure that out, because it will really help your meetings, and it will help you stay focused on the discussion as well. So how many of you have meeting protocol or ground rules that you've set up? Yeah, about half of you. If you don't, I would suggest that you get some. And sometimes they're just very simple, like, you know, show respect, be civil, no personal attacks, don't attack the staff. That doesn't mean you can't criticize staff. And I've told this to councils. Staff, they're all professionals. They're used to getting, if there's something that they omitted in their report, and I'll use an example of Planning Commission and Development Review, and I've seen this, where the Planning Commission says, you know, the staff report was very thorough, thank you very much, but this transportation segment in there, it really didn't give us any traffic counts, it didn't show us how the flow is going to work, it really was a little short, we need more information on that. That's fine, staff can handle that. When you're attacking staff and start to say, well, you're incompetent, this is a terrible report, blah, 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 staff put their tail between their legs, they'll run out of the room and they do not want to come back. I can just tell you that. It's very, very difficult for staff, as well as boards and commissions, if the council's attacking you all for not doing your job and not having a civil discussion about it. It's not productive. There are productive ways to have these discussions and help you do your jobs versus personal attacks. So if you don't have those ground rules, set some up. It doesn't take very long. Like I said, they can be like maintain civility, show respect to one another. And then oftentimes, especially planning commissions, you will have an order of presentation. So you'll see staff report first, applicant, public comment, council discussion, board discussion. Or it might be jumbled up somehow. It might be applicant first, staff presentation, council discussion, public input, then back to council discussion. But there's usually an order. And I've actually seen those posted on chambers walls where they say, here, you know, if you're presenting, here's how it's going to go. And so that when people walk in, they know, or it might be printed on the agenda. So important to have that protocol and procedure spelled out. In terms of your structure, that should be in your enabling legislation. Number of meetings that you have, frequency of meetings, officers, eligibility requirements, And if it's not in your enabling legislation, sometimes it's in another document. So you might be enabled by a home rule charter or the state statute, but there will be another ordinance or resolution that says, okay, Planning Commission is going to meet twice a month on second Tuesdays or second and fourth Tuesdays. There's going to be X numbers. There's going to be alternates, et cetera, et cetera. Here are the officers. You're going to have an organizational meeting, first meeting in January, whatever. So find out what those structural requirements are for your board or commission, and then eligibility requirements, usually pretty lenient. I've actually seen eligibility requirements that enabled to recruit from outside your municipality, and I saw this on an arts board and commission, arts and culture, and they wanted more representation from arts and cultural representatives from outside the municipality. So they recruited people from around the region. It was a pretty powerful regional board, but it represented the municipality basically, but they had a lot of great input from those artists and art experts on that board. Structure and meeting protocol are often left up to the board or commission. If you don't have something that guides that, then spend some time and develop that in terms of your structure and your meeting protocol. Check your enabling legislation, ordinance, resolution. If you're not sure about that, ask your staff. Staff back there, you probably know what those are, right? You've probably seen, oh, here's the ordinance, here's the resolution that establishes this board and spells out your structure, how you're going to work, when you're going to meet, that sort of thing. And if you don't have that, then set it up yourself and adopt it. And get it in the record, get it in the minutes, so at least you have it, and then the next board can follow that and adapt as necessary. So this is what I just said. If you're unclear on your process, your meeting protocol, your working agreements, then have them placed on your next agenda for discussion and agreement. Working agreements, I consider those things in terms of how you operate as a board. So another common complaint I hear is we talk over each other all the time. And I can't, when I'm facilitating a meeting, I can't handle two people talking at the same time. I can't process two English conversations at the same time. I can only listen to one, so it's very important I hear one at a time. So some people can monitor, the chair will monitor that and call on folks. Other people will say, well, you only get called on if you raise your hand. And then the chair will call on you and order as you raise your hand. And then oftentimes the board will help the chair determine who had their hand up in what order. So it's a little more formal, but it does prevent from talking over one another. Other working agreements are, let's not rehash the same thing. Let's not filibuster. So if you feel strongly about something, don't dominate the meeting. Don't waste everybody's time. Make your points, and we'll cycle through the board, and we'll hear all the points. But let's not cycle through 2 or 3 times, repeating the same points. So if you have a point to make, an argument to make your points, and if you left something out or you have one additional thing, fine. But let's not keep this circular discussion going and wasting everybody's time. So those are some pretty basic working agreements in terms of how you work. Other ones I've seen are no sidebar conversations. So oftentimes you'll see on a board, people will start a conversation at the end of the table in a conversational tone while you're having a person speak or testimony being given, or another board member is speaking. And so, again, that comes down to respect for one another, respect for the meeting and the process and the protocol. So that is also a rule. No sidebar conversations. Or if you are going to have a sidebar conversation, I've seen this as a rule, it's in a whispering tone of voice. So if you need to say something to your colleague, you can whisper it. Then it's not as distracting. And I've seen, so those are just some subtleties in terms of how you can operate as a board, and just some basic working agreements to help your meetings run more effectively and efficiently. You see a lot of 3-minute time limits for public input and public hearings. And again, that's for the benefit of everybody in the room and the process, so that you don't allow someone to come up and filibuster for 30 to 45 minutes. Applicants often have quite a bit of time to present their applications to planning commissions. However, when you're hearing public input on an issue or an application, oftentimes it's limited to 3 minutes. Oftentimes the chair lets that person go longer if they need to. But if they go too long, they apologize and say, sorry, make your final points, or I'm going to have to cut you off because we got other people in line to testify. So those are just some simple protocol working agreements in terms of how you can run your meetings more effectively. If you don't have that, put it on your agenda and develop those. So this is a summary. Know your purpose, authority. Be clear on your roles. Know what your roles are. Have a defined board structure. If you don't have that, then create that. Establish meeting protocol and working agreements. Know how your meetings are going to work, how they're going to flow. And then last but not least, respect the process and the people. And I just want to go back and talk about, again, the importance of roles. That if you are an advisory board, it's very important that you stay within that realm. And I'm going to use an example of economic development commissions. Anybody on an EDC here? Good, and then I won't offend anyone. I have seen city councils, and since 2008, economic development has been a priority for almost every local government in the state. You know, we need to get jobs back, we need to get people downtown, we need more sales tax, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of falling off the goals list now because of the recovering economy. But I'd see boards appoint an economic development commission and not give them clarity on what they were supposed to be doing. So then all of a sudden, and they might have an economic development director, but then all of a sudden the board or commission becomes rogue. And they go off and they start contacting, you know, they're calling Bentonville, Arkansas to try and get a Walmart located in their town, or they're pursuing Target or Ross or whatever, or Applebee's to get a restaurant in their little quaint community. And if in economic development, you have to have a strategy. And that strategy needs to be executed with precision. And everybody has to have their roles and responsibilities, because these corporations are very professional. You've got competition out there. And if you're going out there and taking a fragmented approach to this, it will fail. And so it's very important that you have that together. So I've seen EDCs that have become rogue, and they would just go off in this direction and start doing things that really kind of messed up the council's and the staff's strategy. So it's very important to stay within your parameters that are defined in your enabling legislation and your expectations that are defined by your governing board, by your council and your board of trustees. So, and at the same time, I'm not going to let the boards off the hook either. It's important that the council stay focused in their arena. So I've also seen council members attend planning commission meetings and say, you know, by golly, I'm going to attend and sit in this planning commission and make sure that these guys do this right. And then the council member shows up and sits in the back and glares at the planning commission. It's totally out of line. They're not supposed to do that. Planning commissions are supposed to provide objective, unbiased recommendations to the policymaking board. And when you inject council members into that, they are crossing a line. And typically the attorneys, and I've had attorneys do this, tell the council members, you cannot go to the planning commission and try and intimidate them into making a decision. So crossing those lines happens in all directions. And I won't let staff off the hook either, because I talked about that. I've often seen planners or other staff positions that inject themselves into the policy role and try to influence council policy at the council level, and they usually end up getting fired. So that's not a good thing for staff to do. So let's hear from you. Any questions that you have about what I've discussed, your roles, responsibilities, your specific board? It's pretty remedial stuff, but a lot of you are first-timers on this, and it's just important that you have a good grounding in terms of what your roles and responsibilities are. Yes, in the back. Here, I'm going to give you the microphone so we can all hear it, and then I don't need to repeat.
I said my name is Alexa, and I am staff at the City of Westminster for a board that is actually newly forming, and it's the first board that's formed in the city since 1994. So I was wondering if you had any ideas. We wanted to explore options for maybe doing a strategic planning process to get them going with their charge, and as we bring on new board members. Do you have any recommendations around those types of ideas to get a new board started?
Right, and they were adopted by ordinance. And what board is it? What's the name of it?
It will be the Inclusivity Board.
Great, thank you. So it's kind of a diversity board with an emphasis on diversity. Excellent. I think that's great. I would highly recommend a strategic planning process. And typically, strategic planning processes start off with purpose. Who are we? Why are we here? What's our charge? What's our charter? That's your foundation. That's your grounding. Once you do that, then you can start to build upon your roles and responsibilities. And I would also look at that ordinance and see what's spelled out in that as well. Does it give powers, duties, responsibilities? Yes. So I would start with that. Start with the strategic planning process. Have the board members been appointed? They have not. Okay. Interesting. So council might need some guidance from staff in terms of what they're looking for in terms of qualifications and the type of people that they want to populate on that board. And they darn well better be diverse.
Exactly. Well, we had an inclusivity task force that actually really spent the last 9 months putting forward recommendations, learning about the needs in the community and whatnot. So they have a lot of guidance from the task force. I think some of the task force members might apply to be on the board. So there is some history there that is helpful. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, don't put a bunch of white males on the diversity board. Not a good idea. Other questions? Yes, sir. Got about 5 minutes here.
Okay. Joshua with City of Longmont Planning and Zoning Commission. I appreciate, Gary, how you kind of identified policy as sort of the what of the issue and administrative as sort of how. But on P&Z, and you suggested really focusing on the policy. But on P&Z, sometimes we have to dabble with the administrative side of things when we set conditions, which I really hate doing because I do believe that our staff, for example, are the best at doing that. We sit before, the folks once a month. Staff is so deeply involved in these processes. So I think that ends up being a slippery slope when we're trying to set conditions on a project. I wonder if you just have any advice or any words of wisdom to a P&Z, maybe a newer guy like myself, who's really hesitant to tell the developer how to do it, especially if staff didn't lay out that criteria. If they didn't come up with it, how am I going to come up with it? So maybe just some perspective.
Thanks, Josh. Great question. When I talk about the what and the how, it's not, I draw circles. And in theory, the circles are separated, the what versus the how. That's theory. That's not practice. In practice, they're overlapped. And they're overlapped somewhat. So there's some overlap, some shaded area between those circles where the policy and the administration and the conditions in a planning approval get into the administrative, into the how side. The important thing is, my advice there is just recognize when you're in that gray zone. It's okay to be in there because that's how it works in practice. If those circles overlap too much, then dysfunction results and there's lack of clarity in roles. So it is a part of the Planning Commission's job to set those conditions. Some of those do get very granular and some of them do get down into the weeds, but it's also part of your job. It's just important to know how far you're going into there. I always use a rule of thumb when looking at planning approvals, and that is then the quality of the application is directly related to the number of conditions you're hanging on it. So if you have to hang 38 conditions on some planning application, I think you need to look at that and say, maybe we just needed to deny this darn thing if you have to condition it so heavily. So, and you're way over into the how side then. But if you got to hang 3, 4, sometimes for big ones you might have to hang 8 or 10 conditions on there. But I've seen some that have had 40 to 50 conditions on there, and the planners are just going at that point, who's going to follow these? And I can guarantee you, they're very difficult to track when you're 5, 10 years out, and a lot of them fall right through the cracks. So does that help? Thank you. Other questions? Comments? That was a great question. Yes?
I'm Mac from Commerce City. I've been on the Planning Commission for probably, some would say, too many years. And I've been the chairman for the last 10 years. And that's because of being reelected by my board members. One of the things you'll find on the Planning Commission is that you need to do your homework, number one, more so than anybody else involved. The planning staff, the applicant, they've already done their homework. And 9 times out of 10, council may or may not do theirs because their packets are a lot bigger than ours. So consequently, that's the biggest thing is number one, know your ordinances, know your building codes, whatever reference materials you work with, know them up front, know the cases before you go in and sit down. We get our caseload normally 3 days ahead of time. Not a lot of time. So it's incumbent upon us to know our community is number one, have a sense of what our communities are going for. Like Gary said earlier, we need to know what council's direction is, what their general goals are. But it's really up to us to do our homework, number one, more than anything else. And then the other thing for a chairman of a board of any commission or even a council is to have a gavel with a handle that telescopes. That will help you control a meeting more than anything else. And sometimes you could have a short handle used on yourself.
Right, yes. I've actually seen a mayor gavel himself down because he was out of line. It was great. It was classic. Great advice, Mac. And with that, I will thank you for what you do. Yes, reading your packet information is huge, and I guarantee you planning commissions are much more detail-oriented in general than councils are. You'll have councils that do read every word, but a lot of them are very busy, and they depend upon you to read those packets and go through the details. So it's important that you read that information, digest it. And if you do have conditions, see if your staff, challenge your staff a little bit and see if they can hang a citation of your land use code that supports that condition. Because if you can't, I guarantee you the developer is going to look at that and go, you can't support this. So challenge your staff a little bit. And thanks, Matt. Great advice. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for what you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Gary. Okay, so right now we're going to learn a little bit about how to avoid chaos at meetings from Catherine Teich. Catherine is a vice president and has over 20 years experience with regional, national, and international private and public sector organizations, including Transamerica Capital, ING, and Invesco Funds Group, Belco Federal Credit Union, and the U.S. Department of Defense. With significant experience in the areas of strategic planning, process improvement, project management, and as well as training in the Six Sigma methodology, Catherine's qualifications in the field of organizational performance development are strong. She has over 15 years experience in the field of communications, including the design and delivery of market research initiatives, customer segmentation, and database marketing, and the development of collateral materials supporting marketing and communication objectives. She is currently with Core Learning Matters, and I'll turn it over to Catherine. Please help me welcome her. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Such a pleasure to be here and see all of you here inside on another gorgeous Colorado day. We've been so lucky this fall. Let me add just a little bit to my biography as well, and that is that since working the many years that I have in the public sector, in the private sector, I also have been engaged a great deal in the public sector with several engagements with the City of Arvada, running their CIP Citizens Committee decision-making process over a 9-month period of time. Also some business planning for their finance department. Most recently, I was engaged with the RTD in helping their board in a strategic communications initiative and strategic planning initiative. So we had a lot of fun working on that and being engaged. Being engaged in that. All right, now we've done that. We're going to get on with things. So I really want to talk about today. The introductions first. We'll come back to these slides in just a moment. We're going to talk about meetings that work. We'll be talking about procedures and tools, and here's the little bit of the dry part of this where we're going to be talking about parliamentary procedure. I will tell you in advance, parliamentary procedure is a very technical field, and you can study this and become certified in it and so forth. We aren't going to delve into that level of detail today, but we'll be talking about more of a macro overview of that, and then of course we'll conclude the meeting. We'll have some interactivity as well in the meeting. We'll have an opportunity for you to talk with one another, to come up with information for each other. I often find in these kinds of meetings and settings that so much of the valuable and good information comes from you and comes from experiences that you have had or are having in your current organizations. And so we will have an opportunity to be interactive on that. So let's first then ask you, and I'm sure you've probably done this in a couple of these sessions this morning, but for my edification, if you would, very briefly just give name, organization, role, and one or two expectations for our meeting. Yourselves, your functions, your roles. And this is an example of one way that communications within your organizations can really be enhanced by taking the time to find out what people what their backgrounds are, what their interests are, and what their expectations are, most especially. That may not work in a board meeting per se or in a council meeting per se, but it certainly can work in committee structures. And people want to be heard. They want to have known what they are here for, what their hopes and dreams, maybe a little bit strong for the work that we do, but in any case, to have a voice heard. And so I'd really encourage you, in the context of your meetings, where you can, engage this way. Now I'm going to do something that's called an icebreaker, and this is another demonstration of how to get people on the same page. As I mentioned to you that I had done some consulting work with RTD's board of directors, and historically RTD's board of directors has been somewhat challenged to be cohesive in their thinking, and that's not anything against RTD. I think that's very typical of most public policy type agency organizations, and it comes down to people just kind of finding their ways into factions or relationships and not getting outside of those. I noticed a bunch of you who are in your similar organizations, and the same organizations, are all sitting together, for example. You didn't break that up a lot when you sat down. You sat with one another because you know one another, and you probably share a lot of similar feelings and ideas with one another. And now I'm going to challenge you to undo that just for a moment. And so the outside row, you five, are going to quickly collect yourselves just right over there by the coffee pots. This next group of five, because I think I'll probably cross a lot of organizations by going that, just find a little location back by those chairs. This next group, I've got three here, so we're going to add you two in the back row. Just stand together. Okay, so I'm going to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, and you guys go right back by the that picture. All right, now see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2. Yeah, you guys right here. Okay, yeah, you as well. This group. Okay, now let's see how's our math going. Well, let's see. If you probably work together. Yes, you do. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then this last group, you're going to come right up here in this corner. All right, everyone attention please. I'm going to look at my timer. You have exactly 1 minute to find what you have in common as a group, and it cannot be being here at this meeting, and it cannot be serving on your respective roles. So let's go. Ready to go. 1 minute. Stop. I can do that. All right, we're ready to report back. I hear people still talking. What is it about this rule that we're not following? The minute's up. All right. We're going to start in this corner. What are the 3 things you found you had in common? Who's your first? You said 1. Oh, no, I said 3 in 1 minute. Okay, so they got 2. All right.
We got 2. Take it away, Captain.
So we found we all have a love of the Broncos, and we all have kids.
Or on the way.
Or, well, that counts. That counts.
Okay. So they love the Broncos and they all have kids except one is on the way. Do you think that counts? Okay, that counts. All right, sounds good. Congratulations. Congratulations. All right. So I was not clear about the rules. It's 3 things you have in common in 1 minute. Okay. But if you only have one, that's my fault.
Oh. So let's see. We're all from the northern part of the state, not the western slope, not the southern part. We all are married. We all drove here today. We all agree that parking's bad in Denver.
You had a list of 10. That's great. All right, here we go. This group. Who's your spokesperson? We nominated her.
Okay, all of us are transplanted to Colorado. None of us are natives. And we all love hiking. All of us have pets. And we've all been to Mexico. And we realized instead of 3, we have 4, so we are all overachievers.
You are overachievers. Way to go. All right, this group.
Okay, sure.
All
Okay,
right,
so
you look like the person who has to answer.
we're all moms. We all have pets, and we've all been college educated. And then the other thing was we couldn't all be from Colorado because we're from everywhere. She's from New York, and she's actually done more than all of us. Okay, so I feel like I need to do more already in my group.
More groups of overachievers. I love this. You guys have found like 20 things that you have in common. All right. So, spokesperson? Who's our spokesperson? Oh, I guess I'm going to speak for this group. So,
Okay. So we're all civic-minded. We're overachievers. We had many reasons, many things in common. And we have flexible schedules, and we want to give back to our community.
excellent. Okay, thank you. And here we are coming around to the last group here, but not the least by any means. Who's the spokes? Janet. There we go.
We are all from northern suburbs. We are all empty nesters, even him. And none of our communities has a marijuana dispensary, medical or otherwise.
I'm here in Denver, and we have plenty to go around. Okay, take your seats again. Thank you. So again, you know, this I believe demonstrates it's really group dynamics. I mean, this is what our business is about. It's having relationships with people, and even the most thorny issues can be gotten through when you have personal relationships or you feel that you can align with other people. And so I really advocate, and this worked really, really well for the RTD board. It was so fascinating to see how some kind of long-standing divisions among people were overcome just by simple exercises like this, where people were looking for commonalities. At one point in time, I had them sort themselves out by their birthdays. And when they figured out that they were aligned on a birth month or within that time of the year, suddenly a new connection formed between them. So we're going to get into a lot more heavy lifting on things like parliamentary procedure, but I wanted to give you kind of the softer side of communications and urge you to think about, when you're facilitating or having a facilitator come in, employing some of those softer side of things that communications can then foster these harder discussions that we have to have. And now the next thing I'm going to do is just from a time standpoint, I'm not going to call on maybe more than about 3 questions here. I would like a couple of people to let me know, what challenges are you facing at meetings? And if you can think of successful meetings that you have had, what 3 things, let's just call it 3 things, not one thing, 3 things that made those meetings successful. So do I have someone who can volunteer about these 2 topics? What challenges are you facing at meetings? What 3 things made them successful?
Well, a big challenge for me would just getting that interactivity from most people, at least. All people at the table would be great, but there always seems to be a handful or a few that have constant input. So developing a constant rapport with all members would be a great thing. And the one thing, I don't know about three things make successful, but the one thing that goes that direction is having the facilitator of the meeting be somewhat of a motivator, be enthusiastic, upbeat, and really work to bring out that positivity in people.
Okay, great. Another person who'd like to share.
Well, Heather behind you is actually the chair of the board that I'm serving on. And just to echo what she was saying about getting the public involved, I've only been to a couple of meetings, but even all of the planning commissioners weren't at both of those meetings. And there was no public at the public hearing. And so I would agree with her that, you know, getting more just people feeling like they're needed and, you know, we really want their participation, and that would be a big challenge. And then I haven't been on really long enough to determine what's been successful, but I will say coming in as a newcomer, I can see there's a really good rapport with the other, you know, the city planner and the staff and the commissioners. Like, they all really seem to really enjoy each other, and as a newcomer, I've really appreciated that, so.
Really, again, coming back to those personal relationships that help oil the decisions that we make, those difficult decisions that we make. We have time for one more person, if there's anyone else who'd like to share on this topic. Okay. All right, let's move on then. Thank you both for engaging and letting us know what challenges you've faced at meetings, and also what things have been successful for you in those meetings. So in general, the rules that we want to follow all the time, I mean, these are very fundamental rules of communication that we are going to have out in advance as much as possible, at least a solid week in advance, more if there are a lot of attachments and information that has to be considered and read. This is a respect to the members of the group to allow them the time to really study and form opinions about and form questions about. So a clear and concise agenda, communications that are out well in advance of the meeting, starting and ending on time. You'd be surprised how many organizations kind of drag along and don't really honor people's times, and that can also add to some dysfunction within a group if people don't feel that their time is being respected. So start them and end them on time. If you have stragglers, start on time anyway. And it's interesting how quickly they will get the message that these meetings do start on time, and you need to plan for your parking time well in advance of the meeting time itself, for example. All right, and then we do have a series of procedures and tools that we can use to keep meetings going. And this is where we'll engage more in the parliamentary procedure aspect of things. So how many of you use and have in your bylaws or in your organizing documents the Robert's Rules of Order? Yeah, it's good, solid majority. Okay, good. And that's really well known to be sort of the underpinning of, the basis of most organizational functioning, operational instruction, if you will. They do provide for fair and orderly meetings. They promote the rules, or the rights, I should say, of the majority to decide, but also in Robert's Rules, it gives the minority an opportunity to be heard as well. And I heard a number of different people say that there were folks who might dominate meetings or might speak on for more than their time, or go into, perhaps take a rabbit hole off into a different topic that isn't really germane to the discussion at hand. So Robert's Rules of Order really do help us in allowing the minority also to be heard. And it also allows the absent members to be protected. So those are some of the fundamentals. The group, how formal should it be? The group should really decide based on the size of the group, the purpose of the meeting, and you do really make the rules work for your organization. Robert's Rules, I would say, is a solid set of recommendations. It's not kind of chapter and verse on how everything has to happen, but it's using your best judgment. And Robert's Rules is very logical, if nothing else. However, if Robert's Rules seems to be silent on an issue, that doesn't mean that you have to create a whole new committee to study the issue and come up with some way to deal with it. Use your judgment, use your common sense, and then progress and proceed the best you can. I love this Henry Robert saying here that parliamentary law should be the servant but not the master of the assembly. So it serves us, but it's not our master. All right, so bylaws are set by the organization to define the structure of the organization, to describe the responsibilities and rights of the members of the organization, and also really to describe the group's decision-making process. Swallow Hills Board recently had a difficult decision that we had a rather disruptive member that we needed to take action with. And we were very grateful that the time we had taken to really outline the procedures for removing a board member were clearly stated in the bylaws, and we were able to, during a time, quite frankly, that was very difficult for the board itself as a body, we were able to turn to those and implement them in an appropriate and fair way. And so it is important to describe the group's decision-making process on a number of items. The bylaws contain rules that cannot be suspended at any single meeting. These are the overarching rules of operation that you as an organization have agreed to abide by, okay? So this is what the bylaws are. They can, however, with previous notice and a 2/3 vote, the bylaws can be amended, but it takes an action. It takes a vote and a 2/3 vote to be able to do that. And the organization's bylaws should name Robert's Rules as the primary parliamentary procedure or authority. So have it in your bylaws that you're following Robert's Rules of Order, and then again, it becomes much more easy if questions come up about something to turn to those. There's much has been written on Robert's Rules. There are many, many resources out there. Many of the parliamentary certification programs, if not all of them, are using Robert's Rules of Order as the basis for. So this is kind of a field of study. There's a science behind Robert's Rules, and so I advocate that you name in your bylaws that. The basic rules for Robert's Rules are all members are equal, they all have equal rights, and the rights include attending meetings, making motions, and debate. Okay? And debate is a part of the healthy part of our organizations where we can, with the appropriate approach, with the appropriate consideration of one another, and we'll get more into what that looks like in a meeting itself, we can have differences of opinion, and we can come to, one hopes, a consensus on those. Yes, sometimes we have to vote up and vote down, but the much stronger position is to have consensus occur as opposed to one group overriding or overvoting another one. So it does, however, give us the ability to make motions and to debate those motions. Thomas Sowell said people who enjoy meetings should not be in charge of anything, so have to concur. All right, so here are our basic rules for Robert's Rules of Order. A quorum must be present to do business. If a quorum is not present, then the only business that can be conducted is to set the next meeting, to adjourn the meeting, and to recess the meeting, okay? So now what does that mean to you? Does that mean and I'm about to go into this on Monday because most of our board members are not able to be at Swallow Hills board meeting on Monday. So I'm presiding over, I think, 4 or 5 people at the meeting was certainly not quorum. We're not going to be able to make decisions. But what we can do is we can hear the presentation of committee reports. We can hear the presentation from the senior staff members about what's going on. We can debate, not a true motion, but we can debate, we can have conversation. We can agree to carry something forward to the next meeting when the quorum should be present. So it's not that you have to just do these 3 things and leave. You can have a full discussion and learn what's going on with the organization, hear the reports and so forth, but you cannot vote into action anything without a full quorum, okay? All right.
In that situation, the minutes, et cetera, be expected to be enough for the people that were absent to come to the next meeting?
That's an excellent question. So it is, should one expect then for the next meeting that the minutes that are taken at that quorumless meeting is enough for them to have an understanding of what went on at the meeting. And really what happens is pretty much the minutes should be as robust as they can be, appropriately so. They would be expected to read those meetings, and then you pretty much, if you had to have action that needed to be taken at that meeting and had no quorum, you would have to go back through some amount of that information. And in that case, because minutes were available, oftentimes what you can do is just simply assume, by asking the question, that the minutes have been read. You don't have to go into the whole detail. But if there are questions, then you bring them up. Then you come to a formal motion and second, and a discussion and a vote at the meeting where there is quorum. So yes, you really can't decide anything at the prior, but you can discuss. And frankly, I have often seen it happen that the group that was there in effect makes a recommendation, and it's pretty much agreed to because they have considered the issue. It has been considered. All right, thanks. Okay, so Robert's Rules of Order include, that's rather dark, isn't it? So let me get up here. I'm going to use my pointer. Ha! Reading and approval of minutes. Okay, so the first thing that happens is the reading and the approval of minutes. This can be done by consent, and we'll talk about consent in just a minute, okay? And then the reports of the officers and the standing committees come next. Reports of ad hoc committees, and so standing committees versus ad hoc committees. Let's spend just a moment on defining these. Standing committees are those that are established in the bylaws, okay? The ad hoc committees are committees that are formed to consider special events or situations. Again, in Swallow Hill's board's situation, we were looking at the possibility of a new building. And so really that is not a standing committee of the board as prescribed by the bylaws. That's a committee that is being asked to look specifically at an issue or at a project and then bring information back. So the examples in our case of standing committees are the finance committee, or the nominating committee, or the development committee, things like that. Those are prescribed by bylaws. These other special project type committees are not, and they're considered ad hoc. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, all right, so then the reports of the ad hoc, reports of the officers and standing committees first. So this might be the executive director, this might be, the board chair, or rather of the standing committee officers, I should say, and then reports of the ad hoc committees. And then you go to unfinished business, and finally you go to new business. So we'll go through these in a little bit more detail now. All right, so if minutes have been sent to members, there is no reason to read them again. All right, the expectation is if those minutes have been received in advance, that members will have read those in advance of the meeting and that they will come prepared to vote on them. There may be a minor amendment that has to be made, a misspelling of a name, some piece of data that's incorrect, and that can happen in the context of the meeting by someone saying, we need to amend, and making the motion to amend and approved. But there's no need to read them, and they can be approved by general consent. And general consent, again, we'll talk a little bit more about now. This is in effect the board, the chair calling the question. If no one objects, we're going to approve these minutes, and then it just sort of narrows down the amount of time that you spend on administrative steps within the meeting. Almost no one typically objects to the minutes. They've had a chance to read them and look at them, and then we've made any improvements to them that we might need above. The ideal committee is with me as the chairman and 2 other members in bed with the flu. So Lord Milverton thought that was the way for things to run, and there does seem to be a theme here, doesn't there? All right. So something to know, though, any motions that come from a committee report should be taken up immediately. So in the context of, for example, we just said a standing committee or even an ad hoc committee may be making a report to the board. The committee typically is going to have a recommendation. They'll have a motion that they want to have considered in front of the body. And then that is it is at the time that committee report is being given and that motion is being made that action is taken on it. So that's basically the order of operations there. So any motions from a committee report would be taken up immediately. Okay? Unfinished business. Now, this is the next in that list of, the order of things that are happening in the meeting itself. So, items on the agenda of the previous meeting that were postponed. Perhaps additional information was needed. Not everyone was there who would be an important voice to hear in that. Or data needed to be studied, research needed to be done, additional information brought back. So if it has gone as a piece of unfinished business from a previous meeting, then it's going to come up here. And so any item that was laid on the table at the current or previous meeting also would come up under the category of unfinished business. Next, we go on to the motions. And by the way, there isn't really a slide for it, but after unfinished business then is new business, okay? And very typically, what happens here is that it is simply something that people feel that needs to be studied or looked at the next meeting. And so they're going to bring it as an item of new business, and then it will go on to the next month's agenda as an item of new business. Sometimes it can be dispensed with during the meeting itself. And, if it's something simple like, well, when are we going to have a holiday party or something like that, you can get through it right then without a lot of study and time and research going into it. But very often, these pieces of new business are brought to future meetings, and typically then they go right on to the agenda for the following meeting. Okay. All right. Now let's get into the details of motions. I'm going to ask that you not dig in and read your handout here, but there are all kinds of information. There is all kinds of information on the handout that I've given you on parliamentary procedure. And so you can spend time with that, kind of delving into what the various motions are and how they're used and whether majority is needed or not, and, and so forth. But here we're going to touch the high points there. The formal proposal by a member that the assembly take a certain action is what's considered a motion. And business is actually brought before the assembly by these motions of a member. And the basic form of a motion is a main motion, okay? And so the main motion has certain characteristics associated with it. In order to make the motion, you have to say move, right? I so move, all right? Oftentimes you'll find that the chair will call for the motion. Do I have a motion to? And then the person who moves the motion can say, I so move, and then you have a second. And you go there from there to discussion, okay? And then you call for the final vote. Just as we said, so one person moves. Again, oftentimes it's the chair that says, do I have a motion to? And the chair actually states it, okay? And then the first person moves and says, yes, I so move. And now the second member seconds the motion. And it's not really required for motions from committees because those are already considered seconded. All right, because the committee has gone, they have studied this, they have come in with a motion, and so really you can go from the motion to the vote without having to go through the seconds for committees. Prior to the chair stating the question, the motion can be amended. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. You might be having a conversation about something and someone else comes up with a different thought about how this should go. And you actually now, you can't just dispense with that motion that was already on the table. You have to take care of that motion that's sitting out there, right? So you have to get agreement from the mover, from the first person who moved the motion, to amend it. So the motion can be amended by the same maker. Let's say I make the motion and I realize I left two important words out, like how to fund it or something, and then I need to amend my own motion to include the correct information. So by the maker, but the seconder still has to agree to it. Even though I made the motion and you seconded the motion, I may come back and say I need to amend that motion, here's how it should read. You still have to agree to the amended motion by seconding it as well. All right, and so you may also have amendments from another member, and again, you don't really have to go through all the rigmarole of the seconds and so forth if the maker of the motion agrees. So I make a motion, you come back and say, gosh, you forgot that word. I say, oh yes, so I did, I'm fine with it, let's vote, right? So we move on ahead. We don't have to get ourselves stuck in the quagmire of parliamentary procedure if the group is in agreement. Now, if you have one or two sticklers that are got to make sure that you follow every single rule all the time, and almost every group has those. You have the rules then to be able to do it officially, but oftentimes this is in kind of that common sense category of things where we agree, yeah, we just need to add that word, and we go ahead, and we don't require a second if the maker accepts the amendment. All right, so in motions, the chairman states the question, or chairperson states the question. Again, do I have a motion to, and then ensures clarity by restating it, and then only the chair can place the business before the assembly. It's the chair's role to really keep control of the meeting, to keep the meeting moving in the direction that it needs to move. And so the chair oftentimes kind of steps back a bit from discussion, but is there to administer the progress of the meeting. And this is one way that happens. Only the chair can place business before the assembly. Once the question is stated, the motion is pending and it's open to debate. At this point, the motion then really belongs to the assembly, and only the assembly can modify it. So this is, during this discussion period, in debate period, this is where, you have hopefully respectful communications with one another about what this is and what this means, and, what will serve the organization or the citizenry the very best in following through on this. So the motion belongs to the assembly, and only the assembly can modify it. And here, the maker of the motion has the right to speak first. So the chair has said, do I have a motion to XYZ? The first person who speaks is the maker of the motion, the person who says so moved. That person then has the floor to say what they need to say about this motion. And thereafter, then the chair assigns the floor. It shouldn't just be a free-for-all with people saying, oh, well, I have something to add here or there. It's the chair who says, and now we'll hear from Mac, and now let's hear from David. Okay, and gosh, sorry, but you really went on a little too long. They wouldn't say that, but it would be, we're going to limit the discussion now. We need to move on to other topics. Let's have, one way to do that is for the chair to say something like, let's have 2 more comments here. You noticed I did that at the beginning of the meeting. We really didn't have time to go around and hear everyone's story about effective communications examples. So you call for, by limiting, we have time for 2 more motions. After this speaker, we are going to go ahead and vote on the motion. So the chair has the responsibility to continue to move things through. The chair does also have the responsibility to make sure that voices that aren't being heard are heard. And so there may be 1 or 2 people who do dominate, and you may ask them to limit their discussion to 1 minute or 2 minutes, and then you deliberately choose, we haven't heard from Sarah, we haven't heard from Polly or James. What topics, what thoughts do you have about this? And it's the chair's responsibility to try to bring that out as well and make sure that the voices are heard. Okay. All right, so the chair assigns the floor. It should be 1 question at a time and 1 speaker at a time. And the first person to seek recognition of the presiding officer should speak first. This is after the person who made the motion has the first right to speak, right? So after that, then the first person to seek the recognition of the presiding officer should speak first. But again, the presiding officer has the ability to manage that and decide, how long and who should speak and so forth, giving multiple parties the opportunity to weigh in. Comment should be directed to the chair. Now, this is an interesting thing. I think oftentimes what happens is we forget ourselves in the context of these meetings where maybe there's a little bit of emotion attached. And let's say you say something to me, Don, and I don't really agree with it, so I'm going to say back to you, I just don't agree with what you had to say. You can't imagine that you are an agreeable guy, is what you're telling me. It's really not my role to do that with him. If I have an issue with what Don has said, I need to address that to the chair. Okay, and that also will help to smooth the communications here, because the chair, again, is presiding, is keeping order, is keeping rules, can pull back, a comment if need be, can say to the effect, and I've often seen this happen, this would take us in a direction that we don't have time for in this meeting. Would we like to consider moving this off for further research and bringing it back to another meeting or what have you? So the chair then really has the ability to take in the information and then make some decisions about, should this continue in the context of this meeting? Are we going too far down a rabbit hole? Should it be pinned to a future meeting? Do we need additional research on the topic and so forth? So again, the chair, it's really a big responsibility to be the chair. It's really a big responsibility because you have to manage people, and sometimes people don't like it because you're moving on the topic and you're moving through to get the meeting going forward at the appropriate pace. Anyone who has not spoken gets recognized before those who have, in general, by the chair. And it's a good practice to alternate sides. If there are sides of a debate, hear the counterpoint. Hear the point, hear the counterpoint. Again, the chair is presiding over that. And no member may speak more than 2 times on a motion. I have seen this differently with different organizations. So some people allow it to come back more than that, but generally speaking, no more than 2 times on a motion, and speeches should be limited to 10 minutes. Now, 10 minutes, I think, is a long time. Again, this is something that your own organization can determine, and I would say 2. Main motions have to receive full debate. In order to close the debate, someone moves the question and then move to end the debate at a certain time. You can either move the previous question, the options are, you can move to end debate at a certain time, or you can move to limit the motion, rather the length of the speeches. Yeah, this might be a situation where you would say, chair would say, we have 1 more minute to devote to this. We have only so long to be able to spend on this issue. And if further research or further information needs to be had, it isn't going to be in the context of this meeting because we don't have that time to devote to it here, right? Yes, sir. Yeah, it often will happen that, perhaps a member will, and I think happens in many organizations, we are challenged to stay in a governance role. And, a great example, which I'm sure RTD would not mind me sharing, is that there are some times where the board members are debating something like, what should our regional presence from a transportation perspective look like in the northeast quadrant of the city? And then some members might come up and ask questions like, well, how many bolts are under that bridge, for example? Really the number of bolts that are under the bridge, that's an operational issue. That really doesn't have anything to do with governance of the organization. So the board chair in that case would limit the discussion of that and say we need to stay at the strategic level. If there are questions for the staff that relate to this level of detail, either we can have a presentation done at next meeting where we can hear this information, or we'll do this offline. So they move things through. In the interest of time, I'll take one more question here. Okay, sorry about that. We had so much fun with figuring out what we knew about each other. I got a little bit behind on my schedule. And I have to end this on time, right? Isn't that what I told you? All right, so motions to limit debate, you can require 2/3 vote because they suspend the fundamental right of every member. This is an important thing because when we say we're limiting debate, it is saying you don't have your fundamental right in effect. We are limiting debate here. So 2/3 have to agree that that is appropriate, all right? And Joseph Joubert said it's important, or it's better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it. So there are some great quotes. Now voting, here's that general consent thing. If there is no objection, this is exactly the kind of comment or statement to make when you're approving minutes, for example, or when you're adjourning a meeting. Things like that are totally administrative, do not need to take the time of the assembly to go through the whole seconding and debate and discussion, just not necessary. If, however, anybody objects, then you have to go through the process. But many administrative basic things can be handled this way. And when you're voting, you can go by voice, by show of hands, by rising vote, by ballot, by roll call. Those are just all methods of getting the vote taken. Again, if there's even one objection to a vote by unanimous consent, then you've got to go through the whole formal aspect of it. All right? And so Robert's rule says a majority vote is a majority of voting members. And Mark Twain, who's always great to listen to whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect, right? Okay, so a majority is more than half, and if the vote is a tie, then the vote fails. Majority is more than half. The chair in the voting will announce as a result it's either carried or it's adopted, it's lost, or it's rejected. And once a decision is made, an identical motion must not be brought forward at the same meeting. Now, the main motion, there are types of them. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because you have it in your handout, all right? So the types of motions are main, subsidiary, and incidental. We'll just go through these very quickly. They can be made only when no other motion is pending and only one of them at a time. Subsidiaries help to deal with a main motion, and there are the types there. Refer it, postpone it, kill it, amend it. And again, in your handout, the very details of how these happen are listed there. Incidental motions arise from a pending question, things like point of order or the rules being followed. Do we need to suspend the rules? Are you violating your own rules? And so forth, okay? And again, these are outlined. And we won't go into a lot of detail here. Lay on the table versus postpone to a certain time. Call the question friendly amendment. These are some things that we'll talk about a little bit here. But lay on the table you use when unexpected business arises and it needs a motion to bring it back. Postpone it to a certain time is used if more time is needed to make a decision. That will then come up automatically as an item of unfinished business on the next meeting's agenda. If you call the question an action to immediately ask for a vote in a way, this is basically limiting the debate, right? To determine if debate should end or continue, speaker has to be recognized, does need a second, requires a 2/3 vote. All of this is in the charts in your handout as well. So as you go through those, you'll perhaps have questions there. So the friendly amendment, who owns the action? Only the assembly can amend a motion through a majority vote. And then a point of order, any member may call a point of order when he believes someone is acting improperly. This has to happen when the violation occurs. This is a difficult one. If you call a point of order, it means something is going on in the meeting itself that needs to be adjusted. And so this is an important capability, but it's rarely used. It's rarely used. And you know, when you have a point of order, it also can sort of set sides at one another. It's better to do this in discussion or with the strong chair recognizing that this needs to happen. Okay. All right, so a violation never challenged is never a violation, Robert says. If you can't remember your rules, the main thing here is what is the fairest thing to do to protect the rights of the member. Robert's rules very much promote fairness. It's the basis for Robert's rules, and as I said when we started, it's common sense, a lot of it. If you have to then turn to Robert's rules for the chapter and verse, then you have the capability of doing that. But my suggestion is, in the most part, you know, Robert's rules is a great guideline. There are details available there. Most of the time it's common sense. So it's logical and efficient. And so that really brings us to the conclusion. I did want to take just a minute for a couple of questions from you, if there are any. And I realize this was kind of the fire hose approach to parliamentary procedure. Recognize that there are certified parliamentarians out there who your organizations can work with and really get into the detail of how Robert's rules work and meeting dynamics. Yes, sir.
Sure. Thank you, Catherine. This is really helpful. You mentioned that when there's a disagreeing member, let's pretend I don't agree with my chairman, and typically how I would handle that is I'd say something like, I'd encourage the commission to consider this. But you suggest really addressing the chairman when there's a disagreement. How might that go? Should I say, I'd encourage the chairman to consider this perspective? Or how do you, if it's not the chairman, if it's someone else, but I'm supposed to address it to him, what's the elegant way of doing that?
Yeah, that's really an excellent question. And again, you know, these are overall guidelines as well in the context of your group and depending how cohesive you are. You know, some of this is a little bit stilted, it could be. But, you know, you might say something to the effect of, from my perspective or from my organization's part of the perspective, we feel additional study is needed on this element chair. Is that something that we could put on next meeting's agenda or I would like to recommend or suggest that we consider a body to research this, or a subcommittee, or you may have a recommendation around how you want it considered, which is certainly appropriate to share. But it is best to go through back to the chair, because the chair is really the presiding officer, and the chair needs to make the decision whether that goes on the next agenda, whether a committee in context is formed, in context with the group as a whole, make the decision as to whether perhaps a separate committee is formed. So that's a great question. Thank you very much. And I am at time, so I need to give it up to Miss Lisa.
Great information. Thank you so much. Okay, so Jeff Wilson is a colleague of mine. Jeff drafts legislation, provides research and advice, and represents CML before the General Assembly, various state agencies and officials, and the appellate courts on various matters affecting municipalities. He also provides information to municipal officials on legal matters through our inquiry service. His areas of particular emphasis include sales and use tax, TABOR, telecommunications, elections, open meetings and open records, land use, oil and gas regulation, and utilities. He provides legal services to the League on internal matters as well, and has been with the League since 1987. He does have a couple of handouts that were on the table. Does anybody need them? I moved them to the front here because I think I caught everybody. Okay. And one other thing, I'm actually heading out to an appointment, so please allow me to take this time to thank you for coming. CML is a resource for you and your colleagues in your cities and towns across the state, and we truly appreciate meeting you today and hope you found it of value, and look forward to serving your needs in the future as well. So please help me welcome Jeff.
Hi, everybody. Well, that was a nice introduction, and I always like to get the applause before I say anything. I'm going to cover a couple of really important topics today: open meetings and open meetings and conflicts of interest. And I've given you a couple of really detailed outlines. I'm going to work pretty much from those outlines. It'll save you taking a bunch of notes. There's way more detail than normal humans walk around with in their head in those outlines. And I don't expect anybody to remember all that stuff. But what is not hard to remember are the public policy objectives behind both of these laws. And if you remember those, my experience is nobody really gets in trouble with these statutes as long as they remember that the purpose of the open meetings law is we're doing the public's business. They have a right to know when we're doing it and come and watch us do it. The conflicts of interest laws, which I'm going to cover, you shouldn't feather your own nest financially by virtue of your public position. If you keep those two things in mind, you're going to be fine. And my experience is people with a basic moral compass, long before they run afoul of these laws, something occurs to them that they ought to talk to their municipal attorney. They may be getting in deep. So that's the good news with all of this is especially with the conflict of interest stuff, I don't hear about a lot of violations. Open meetings, a much more volatile area, and I hear about a lot of at least alleged violations of the open meetings law. Far fewer actual, but it's a very, very high profile area. I always want to emphasize that it'll add to your cynicism, but a lot of the calls I get from concerning conflicts of interest in particular aren't from elected officials and people on boards and commissions that are worried about their own personal conduct running afoul of these ethical standards. No. They're loading up on their political enemy. They think they're cool and that other guy's a slug. And so my attitude is this stuff's pretty easy to comply with. Don't give your adversaries an angle. I mean, and this stuff also looks awful in the newspapers, and so we'll go through these outlines. I'll take questions as I go. I may have to cut them off because I have to get through a lot of material in an hour, but I'll try and do it as we go. First, let's see, what do I want to do first? I think I'll do conflicts of interest first. Take that outline out. There are three three basic laws that I'm going to cover here about conflicts of interest. The three basic statutes. Now, before I go into those, let me highlight something. Colorado law allows municipalities to develop their own ethics and conflict of interest standards. So you may have stuff locally in your jurisdiction. This may not be the whole picture for you, so just there's that caveat. The three statutes I'm going to talk about are, there's a section of the criminal code that deals with this. You should hope you never have to deal with that section of the law. There's some stuff in Title 24, the Public Officials Code of Ethics, that I'm going to go through. This is sort of the meat and potatoes of ethics in Colorado. And then in Title 31, which is the municipal code, there's the disclosure and abstention rule. And that's probably the sort of most high-profile conflict of interest law that most folks run into in day-to-day life. Let's go to the second page of the outline. The Code of Ethics in Title 24, there's rules of conduct, and then there are guidelines. The rules are mandatory, the guidelines are not. So in this outline, I just cover the rules. But I want you to know that you can go look. The guidelines are also useful to review, and I recommend them to you. But for purposes of this outline, I want to go through what the law requires. And again, as I go through this, think about my comment about a moral compass, okay? Okay, here, first rule. Don't use confidential information for your personal benefit. What does the rule say? You may not disclose or use. Notice we've got to parse these things. You can use it, or you can give it to somebody else and they can use it. Disclose or use confidential information, not just any information, but confidential information acquired in the course of your official duties to do what? In order to further substantially your personal financial interest. That's a no-no. And financial interest is defined as a substantial interest held by an individual, which is, and I've listed them down there. The two big ones are A and D. An ownership interest in a business, or an ownership interest in real or personal property. So you get confidential information at the town that they're going to be some kind of highway improvements. So you get your pal to go out and buy all the real estate around the interchange that's going to be built. That would be an example of the kind of thing, and that looks awesome in the newspaper too, by the way. Stuff like that's great. So that's an example of this. This next one, Amendment 41 is in the same area. Amendment 41 passed a few years ago, added to the Constitution. Amendment 41 isn't really a conflict of interest thing. It's a limitation on contributions to elected officials and covered officials. No more than $53 a year in benefits from the same donor. That's basically the rule. If you take more than $53 from the same donor, there better be consideration, like you better be doing something for it. That's Amendment 41 in a nutshell. This rule of the Code of Ethics is sort of similar to that. It says you all won't accept a gift of substantial value or a substantial economic benefit that amounts to the same thing. If either one of those would tend to improperly influence a reasonable person to depart from the faithful discharge of his public duties, or which a reasonable person would know under the circumstances is primarily for the purpose of rewarding him for his official action. The first is the inducement, the second is the reward. Do something you wouldn't otherwise do because you got this benefit, and it's a reasonable person standard, notice? So, hey, I didn't think getting a free car from the guy who had an application for a rezoning to expand his car lot, I didn't treat that as that didn't influence my decision. Well, that's not good enough, because it would influence anybody, Pure of heart defense doesn't work. So just note that it's an objective, reasonable person standard. Economic benefit, they give a couple of examples of economic benefits that are tantamount to a gift of substantial value. Now, do you really need the law to tell you this? Look, a loan at a rate of interest substantially lower than what you usually get, or getting paid a lot more than you should be getting paid for the work you're doing. This isn't right. It says right here in the law. Hey. So anyway, don't do those things. And you don't really need the law to tell you, I hope. The next, oh yeah, here's one you really need the law to tell you. Look at number 3 on the next page. You shouldn't have a transaction, you shouldn't do a government transaction with one you supervise or inspect, a private transaction with one you supervise or inspect in the course of your official duties. And the rule says, you shall not engage in a substantial financial transaction for your private business purposes with a person whom you inspect or supervise in the course of your official duties. Well, so I guess I can't be a partner in a building company and also be the building inspector that inspects the construction too. So don't do that either, okay? Watch out for that one. Now this fourth one is one to keep in mind because of its breadth. Acts benefiting one's business or client, the rule. You won't perform an official act directly and substantially affecting to its economic benefit a business or other undertaking in which you have either a substantial financial interest, and that's that definition from earlier involving real estate and business interest, or is engaged as counsel, consultant, representative, or agent. So this is sort of the encapsulation of the don't do anything in your official position to benefit your business. And happily, I don't get a lot of questions on this. Just note the broad definition of official act that I've put in the deadline, in the outline. Couple of exclusions here. It's okay to use government facilities or equipment to communicate with constituents. Sure, that's what you're elected or appointed to do. Family members, that's reasonable. Hey, look, business associates, you can run your real estate business out of City Hall while you're an elected official. Awesome, it says right here. Well, it makes my point that there are plenty of legal ways to look like a complete idiot, okay? Really, there are, and here's one of them, so just because it's legal doesn't make it smart or doesn't make it look good on the front page of the newspaper. So I always advise that as the sort of operating rule rather than just, you ought to be legal too, of course, but by being smart, you can be legal in the process. And let's see, and the other thing to remember though about talking to your constituents, and you guys are boards and commissions for the most part, but elected officials have to worry about, you can't use public property to communicate with constituents when you're running for re-election because you can't use public money to support your campaign, and that's fair. Everybody has to pay taxes, but everybody doesn't support your campaign for office. So that's a little legal pitfall you got to watch out for. And the other exclusion here, you can accept or receive benefits as an indirect consequence of transacting local government business. I have no idea what that means, okay? This is something you use as a defense when somebody's pointing their finger at you and telling you you're doing something wrong. You say, oh, it was an indirect consequence of the transaction of local government business. So don't use this as a license to go out and do things. Use this as a defense. Now, speaking of defenses, this next section is a voluntary disclosure. Basically what this says is, under Section 110 of the Code of Ethics, you can file a disclosure with the Secretary of State about any pending or likely conflicting interests that may come up. Here's the way this comes up. You own the only backhoe in town. You're thinking that if there's a flood, you're going to be the guy that gets called on to come and, dig out the culvert through Main Street and everything. There isn't going to be time for a bidding process, and you're also on the town board. So are you going to, you might be in a position where you have to engage in official action that involves hiring you to go take an emergency action. Well, that is going to be okay, particularly if you've made a disclosure under Section 110. What Section 110 disclosure provides is that it's a complete affirmative defense to any civil or criminal action, which is pretty darn broad. It's pretty broad protection for the individual. Although, that's nice, but I want to just add, the problem here usually isn't the individual that's getting smeared, it's the institution. The whole town looks bad. But know about that you and your attorney should pay attention to that Section 110 disclosure thing. There are lots of possibilities. You own the only gas station in town, and all the cop cars gas up at your gas station, and you're the mayor. or you're on the town board or something, you know. You're going to have to vote on approving the fuel contract. So these sorts of things, these kind of disclosures keep you clean. Also in the Code of Ethics, if you go to the next page, there's some prohibited interests in contracts. You'll be delighted to hear that I'm not going to go through each one of these in laborious detail. But what this says is local government officials, employees, shall not be interested in any contract made by them in their official capacity or by any body, agency, or board of which they are members or employees. There's the rule, pretty broad. You can't have any interest in contracts. But then what's important about this restriction on contracts is really the exceptions. And you see the exceptions are pretty well crafted to avoid self-dealing. Look at the first two. Contracts awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. So you can have an interest, you can have a conflict, if you will, as long as the contract was awarded to the lowest responsible bidder, and that's you. Not a problem. I always get this question, hey, I really like this glass-fronted bookcase in City Hall, and I'd like to buy it, you know, and I'm on the board or something. Can I do that? Well, another exception, merchandise sold to the highest bidder at a public auction. So you notice up, hey, who wants to buy the bookcase, and you auction it off, and you can, if you are the low bidder, you get it, and there's no issue under the law. There's one I'm not going to read here about geographic restrictions. It allows this, you know, you make a contract with the guy who has the backhoe in town because it's much more complicated to go many miles away in an emergency. E is the important one, though. E is the disclosure and abstention rule. If you've complied with the disclosure and abstention rule, in the course of approving the contract, you don't have a contract invalidity problem. And let's go then to the next page, the disclosure and abstention rule, because this is sort of the big deal for municipal officials right here. Okay, what's the rule? A member of the governing body, and see, this is one that this is a rule that I'm sharing with you guys, even though on most of your boards and commissions, just so you know what your governing body is operating under. This is an example of something that doesn't technically apply to you, and you might want to talk to your city attorney, or you should talk to your city attorney before acting pursuant to it. But it's, I think, good public policy. It avoids the appearance of impropriety, and here's the rule. Member of the governing body of a city or town who has a personal or private interest in any manner proposed or pending before the governing body shall do three things. One, disclose such interest to whom? To the other members of the governing body. Don't vote. And finally, don't attempt to influence the votes of the other members of the governing body. Okay, well, now, number of issues here. What is meant by personal or private interest? Okay, it's not helpful. There isn't a lot of case law on this. The limited case law there is says that it's a pecuniary interest. You shouldn't, again, I said, you shouldn't feather your own nest financially. The case law reflects that. There was a case up in Minturn about 15 years ago where a church was applying for an expansion of their parking lot, and 5 of the 7 members of the town board went to that church, right? Okay, do they have a personal interest in the matter pending such that they shouldn't be able to vote on the approval of the land use for the expansion of the church parking lot? They got sued, went to court, judge said, no, not a conflict. Nobody realized a financial gain as a result of this happening. This was, and you know, it's a lot of this stuff in conflicts is about, is the benefit or the burden personal to you or generalized? And in the case of this church parking lot expansion, it was more of a general community issue than the individuals involved, so said the court. Okay, also, what about this last element about not attempting to influence the votes of the other members of the panel? Well, your local attorney's practice will determine what that means, okay? Some attorneys say you shouldn't even be in the room. Your mere presence is intimidating to the other people who are voting, and you ought to not be around. Others think if you just stay there and keep your mouth shut, that's fine. So that's kind of a local practice. There isn't any case law on that. There's an exception. I'm not going to go through all the elements. The exception is basically if it's an emergency and your participation, you know, a couple people are absent and you need to vote in order to enable the body to do something, that's okay. As long as you do that disclosure I talked about a minute ago under Section 110. You have to do that first. So one reason to file your 110 disclosure at the beginning of your term is so when the situation arises where you have to vote notwithstanding a conflict, you're ready to go. I've actually seen or heard of incidents of meetings being suspended while somebody files their Section 110 disclosure by fax and they reconvene the meeting and vote. There's better ways to do business. You know, that's a little loosey-goosey for me. Now this next one, a criminal disclosure requirement. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I've never heard of anybody being charged under this. Basically, if you have a strong interest in a contract that your city is looking to enter into, and you're getting ready to be involved in some sort of official action regarding that contract, like approving it, recommending it, or voting on it, you should not vote on that. If you do vote on that, you should have disclosed under Section 110 to the Secretary of State 72 hours beforehand. This is why it's important to file well ahead of time, because no way are you the little recess the meeting and file the disclosure thing. That doesn't work for the criminal code provision. That only works for the disclosure and abstention law. So that's conflict of interest at racehorse speed. Oh, awesome. Any questions on conflicts before I go on? Yes. This concept of bias, there's legislative actions, which is what I'm contemplating when I'm talking about these disclosure and abstention rules. And then the body is sometimes in land use context, particularly involved in quasi-judicial proceedings, where quasi-judicial proceedings are a particular applicant wanting a particular approval, and that applicant is entitled to various due process under the Constitution, including, and so are his neighbors or her neighbors. And so everybody that's in the zone of notice, if you're doing a quasi-judicial proceeding, you have to notice a certain number of people. If the person, in your example, the member of the board, is within that notice zone, then you got a bias. You got a real question of whether they can continue to be unbiased in the issue. Now, if it's a legislative matter, though, and this is like an example I often use. If you're a downtown business person and the proposal before the board is improving curb and gutter and street lights and doing something that inures to the benefit of all the business people downtown, can you vote on that? Sure. You were probably elected because you're a business person downtown. Same with your guy. Maybe he was elected to serve that neighborhood and to reflect that neighborhood's feelings and beliefs and so on and so forth. And there's no conflict involved except for if it's a quasi-judicial proceeding, then you have different considerations. You bet. Anything else? Yeah. The first issue is whether somebody declining to vote because of a conflict affects the quorum. They're present but not voting. If it does, if your attorney determines that it affects the quorum, then you have these provisions in here that allow somebody to vote notwithstanding a conflict if they do proper disclosure. If it's quasi-judicial, which was your hypothetical, maybe you lay the matter over until the next meeting when there's another warm body in the room. That might be what you're stuck doing, really. I mean, because it isn't in the land use applicant's interest to have anybody vote on it whose vote is tainted by bias, because then that could overturn the developer has a tainted approval that is subject to being voided or overturned, and I wouldn't want that. I'm spending a lot of money. I want it rock solid legal, and I'd be willing to wait another 30 days to get that done, maybe. I know that's an ambiguous answer, but it's very fact determinative. Okay, let me go on to open meetings, and then after I do that, you can ask me anything you want about open meetings, or if you think of anything extra regarding conflicts, I'll do that. Okay, this open meeting stuff, what I've given you is a chapter out of this publication of the municipal leagues that I wrote, called Open Meetings and Open Records. Consequently, it's just so good. And my grandfather used to say, modesty is the quality I like best about myself. So anyway, hopefully this is a helpful book. I've given you the open meetings chapter. You should all have this around your city someplace, probably in the clerk's office or the manager's office. So open meetings. Just like with ethics, this is another area where some of you may have local provisions. Not as common as with ethics, but sometimes some home rule jurisdictions will have additional bases for going into executive session or more limited bases for going into executive session and other stuff that is local. And so just know, again, caveat, this may not be your whole picture in your jurisdiction. Okay, going over to the next page. Now, the scope of this law is very much determined by some critical terms that are used in the law. And I start off by dealing with some of those. The scope of the open meetings law, it covers meetings of local public bodies. So what is a local public body? Well, you see I get into it right there at the beginning. Any board, committee, commission, or other policymaking, rulemaking, advisory, or formally constituted body of a political subdivision. Really broad. The takeaway is it ain't just the governing body, it's planning commission, various kinds of boards and commissions, all subject to the open meetings law. One thing you should know, look at the end of that paragraph, persons on the administrative staff of the local public body are specifically excluded. So if they're having a meeting of the Public Works Department, that you don't have to give notice under the open meetings law to have a meeting in the Public Works Department or the clerk's office or any place else. But you do have to give notice if the Planning Commission is meeting. So, and what is a meeting? A meeting is any kind of gathering convened to discuss public business in person, by telephone, electronically, or by other means of communication. Now, the advent of digital and telephone communication has really made the open meetings law complicated, especially email. Email is a nightmare in terms of the open meetings law, because when you have a certain number, and we'll get into this in a second, when you have a certain number of people involved, you have to give notice. Well, you don't know when you start an email string how many people are going to be involved, and then suddenly when somebody's involved, you got a violation, right? And is that me? No. So there's a lot of conversation among the attorneys about how to avoid putting your foot in it under the notice provisions of the open meetings law in terms of email. And perhaps the best piece of advice I ever heard on this was never use reply all, because you need a requisite number of people to trigger all this stuff. So if you never use reply all, it's just one-on-one. All the communication is one-on-one. It's not 1 in 5 or 1 in 3 more that three. That's why I went to law school, right? To avoid the math. 3 more. My wife's the tax lawyer. She takes care of the books. Okay. One thing I always get asked about is at the bottom of the page. I grew up in a small town, and you go in the coffee shop, and pretty soon here comes another guy that's on the town board with you, and pretty soon then there's another one. And they sit down, you're all talking. Well, that requires openness. If the newspaper reporter comes in and you're talking about public business, theoretically, if that was planned, he or she, the reporter, gets to sit down and listen to what you're talking about. But here it says, chance meetings or social gatherings of public officials at which the discussion of public business is not the central purpose are not subject to the provision of the open meetings law, okay? Here's an opportunity to look like a jackass in the newspaper, because you can have a barbecue at your house and invite everybody over to talk about public business and then try to use this exception. It'll look like just awful. So this is another one where it's good as a defense. And it covers a lot of handy stuff. Like I always get the question at the conference or when I'm talking about this in other venues, hey, 4 of us drove up here in a car from, Williamsburg or someplace. And is that a violation of the open meetings law? No. The discussion of public business was not the central purpose. You're coming up here to go to a seminar. Be aware of that exception, though. It's a good defense. Oh, retreats. Always get questions on this. Hey, we're going to have a retreat to see if we can all act like we're older than 11. Does the media have to be there while we discuss our problems? And the answer is yeah. It's a gathering. It's a meeting. However, there's no requirement that your meeting be in your town. If you're, if you're from Burlington, you could have your retreat in Estes Park. I mean, I'm being a smart ass. I mean, there's ways to diminish the likelihood that your town reporter will show up to attend your retreat if you have your retreat a long ways away. But why did I say something that foolish in public? Anyway, retreats are covered. Openness requirement. Now we get into the mandates in the law. Whenever 3 or more members, or a quorum of members if it's fewer than 3, and see, that's talking about like the county commissioners. If you got 3 county commissioners, the quorum is 2. But for municipalities, the 3 or more members of a local public body get together and public business is discussed or formal action may be taken, then the meeting has to be open to the public. And notice it's disjunctive. It's either discussion of public business or where formal action may be taken. So there's openness. Second requirement, notice, slightly different requirements here. Any meeting at which the adoption of any proposed policy, position, resolution, rule, or regulation, or formal action occurs, or, and here's the critical one, at which a majority or quorum of the body is in attendance, or, this is the critical one, or is expected to be in attendance, you have to give full and timely notice. So if you think a quorum is going to be there, even if they don't show up, you have to have given notice. And the law doesn't say what full and timely notice means. It gives an example of notice by posting, but that doesn't mean that's how you have to do it. People use all different kinds of forms of posting. My advice here is your clerk in your jurisdiction probably has a standard way of posting meetings. Stick with it. Don't do anything unusual. Don't do anything surprising. Just do what your community expects to be done in terms of notice. I get questions here from time to time. You know, is this a situation where we have to provide notice because, well, it's like, you know, you don't get in trouble for over noticing, and it's usually not a hassle. So just notice stuff. When in doubt, give notice. You know, you get in trouble for not noticing, and it's, you know, this is a simple key punch. Yes. As I said, the question was, is a website posting full and timely notice under the open meetings? City website. Talk to your attorney. Isn't that a courageous answer? Well, here's why. Because we're moving more and more to that kind of notice, and it's being accepted and understood in a huge segment of the population. If they want to know when a meeting of a board or commission or the city council of a given jurisdiction is, they go to the city's website. They don't look in the legal notices in the back of a newspaper of general circulation that has a second-class mail permit, which is what the law requires for formal published notices. And I think these agendas and stuff like that, notices of public meetings, there isn't a lot of detail there. So probably that form of notice, if that's how in your jurisdiction notice is customarily given for all manner of other public meetings, probably fine. I only make the comment about the attorney because I've learned from giving these that, you know, your own attorney may have different views than mine, and in that case, your attorney's a genius, and I'm just working hard at it. Okay, next page, minutes. See, we've had 3 big requirements here, right? We've had openness, notice, and now minutes. Now minutes, any meeting of a local public body at which the adoption of any proposed policy, position, resolution, rule, regulation, or formal action occurs or could occur. Where formal action could occur, you have to take minutes. So lately, here's one way this comes up. I've had questions lately. Can we go into an executive session from a work session? And yeah, you can. We'll get to work. Executive session, you go from a regular or a special meeting. As long as your work session is a regular or special meeting, you can do it. But you have to have a vote. That's formal action. So if you're going to go into executive session from a work session, you probably should have somebody there taking minutes, because they're also, in the executive session procedures, you have to put stuff in the minutes about what statutory citation gives you the right to go into executive session and what you plan on talking about and so on and so forth. And you can't, obviously, if you're not taking minutes, you can't comply with that requirement. So heads up, you don't need to take minutes in a work session if there's no formal action that could be taken. But if anybody gets it in their, it gets the idea of going into an executive session, this is something to raise. Okay, executive sessions. By far the area that I get the most questions about. Why? Because remember, the public policy behind the open meetings law is we're doing the public's business, the public has a right to see it, and come and see us getting about it. And executive session is an exception to that. This allows the government to do business in private. But the theory, or not the theory, the intent of the General Assembly here is that the public's interest is best served by these discussions happening in private. Not the politicians, not you all, but that the public's interest is better served. And you'll see this when we go through the reasons that executive sessions are allowed. Take a look at this first one. The executive sessions are only allowed on specific topics, okay? And here's a list of some of them. Property transactions. Now, can you imagine your jurisdiction's trying to buy a piece of real estate and the seller's attorney is sitting in the audience while you're discussing what your bottom line is and what your issues are with the property? The result of that is going to be the taxpayers end up paying more money for the property. So that's why it's in their interest that you be able to discuss this without having the seller's attorney in the room. Next one. Oh yeah, so you get sued. If you have to discuss your litigation strategy and what all your weaknesses are in terms of your case with the other counsel sitting in the room, you're just shooting yourself in the head. So obviously we're able to speak with our attorney in executive session without the other side there. This, you get into wild situations here sometimes. In my career, I've had situations where a member of the board will sue the rest of the town that insists on being in the executive session when they talk about how to defend against it. You hope you never have to be part of that. Let's see. Later on we'll talk about how executive sessions are for deliberation only. They're not for making decisions. You're supposed to go into executive session and all talk about stuff and try and deliberate, but you're not supposed to take formal action and vote and so on and so forth in executive session. Well, there's an apparent exception to that in one of these grounds for executive session concerning negotiations, the bottom of the page. You can determine positions relative to matters that may be subject to negotiations, develop a strategy for negotiations, and instruct negotiators. By the way, municipalities often use multiple bases for executive session, right? So you could go into executive session to discuss real property transactions, get advice from your attorney, and instruct negotiators. See? So that isn't one, you can use multiple of them. And this one has the governing body reaching a conclusion, making a decision on a negotiating strategy. So that's a little bit of an exception. Over to the next page. Personnel matters, by far the biggest issue. By far the biggest issue. Obviously, especially in small towns, you talk about personnel matters in executive session. You're protecting the interests of perhaps an innocent employee if it's an investigation. You protect that the failure to do that can have very serious legal consequences for the town. So as can any kind of screw up with personnel these days, by the way. It's just a thicket. The thing to remember here is if you're going to go into executive session and talk about somebody, they get to be told that you're going to do that. And they get to say, no, I don't want you to talk about me in executive session. You have to talk about me in public. And the theory behind that is if somebody's getting railroaded, railroading doesn't work as well in daylight. And the employee who thinks they're getting screwed can make that happen to them in public and with the newspaper there and everything else. So this is, there's a duty to notify the employee if you're going to talk about them. Now, procedures for calling executive sessions. These are really important because if you don't follow them, there was a court case a few years ago where Sterling didn't follow them. And the result was that the record they made of the executive session, the tape recording, was a public record. What an unpleasant surprise for the people that were in that executive session. I mean, what they're running their mouth about this and that, and it's in the newspaper. So the law sets out very specific steps. I've mentioned some of them already. You can only have an executive session at a regular special meeting. You don't have to give any particular notice of an executive session necessarily, but to go into executive session, you have to have a vote. You first announce the topic for a discussion in the executive session. including the specific citation of the open meetings law that authorizes the topic of the executive session. And this is where you say negotiations on real estate involving conferences with the attorneys. So you're given 3 bases there. Third, identification of the particular matter to be discussed in as much detail as possible without compromising the purpose for which the executive session is authorized. What does that mean? Well, here's what that means. When we were negotiating this part of the law down the street, the press association, it was on this personnel matter thing. And they wanted us to, like if we were gonna have an executive session they wanted us to name the person we were gonna talk about. And I said, I won't say what I said. I said no, with some extra words in there ahead of time. And because I said, you know, if you say, oh, we're gonna talk about Betty, well, then the reporters will go talk to the people Betty goes to church with, the people Betty works with, and then somebody will say, you know, maybe it's because Betty's having an affair with the fire chief. Well, it isn't because of that at all. Maybe it's because Betty was wrongfully accused of something else, and she's going to be cleared of it. And but for this putting her name in the newspaper, poor Betty's life wouldn't have been ruined in this town. So we really pushed back hard on that, and so we said that would defeat the purpose for which the executive session is allowed. And so that's how we get in the law. Well, you have to tell us everything that won't interfere with the purpose for which the executive session is allowed. So that's what that means. Talk to your attorney. It's very esoteric. Then 2/3 of the quorum have to vote affirmatively to go into the executive session, and the minutes, say, like I was talking about a minute ago, have to reflect the topic of discussion at the executive session. I've already mentioned this stuff at the bottom of the page about deliberation rather than decision-making being the purpose. Now, a few years ago, the Press Association went down to the Capitol and said, we know that these guys are talking about stuff they shouldn't be talking about in executive session. Well, how do you know that? Well, because somebody told us. This is how laws are made, the Capitol. So, now we have a recording requirement where we have to, when you go into executive session, you have to make a tape recording of what happened. And the law says you have to keep it for 90 days, and then if your records retention schedule allows you to get rid of the tape, you may. The tape recording, however, is not a public record. Everybody off the street can't come in and ask for an executive session tape recording. The tape recording is there if a person reasonably believes, it's this objective person standard again, if there's circumstances that would lead a reasonable person to believe that the body got off topic or made a decision, then you can go to the judge and say, Judge, will you listen to this tape? I mean, I think they did it. And it's off the newspaper that's doing this. Then the judge will listen to the tape, and if you did the bad thing, got off topic or made a decision, then that portion of the tape, not the whole thing, just that portion is made public. So that's the role the tape plays. Penalties for violating the open meetings law. Well, the penalty legally is the action tainted by the violation is void. Ab initio, it's just, you know, if there was a violation, the action is void. That's a pretty heavy duty penalty. And it causes people to look back carefully over the method of adoption of ordinances when they're charged with violation of them. You know, they want to see if there's any screw ups under the open meetings law that they can use to attack the validity of the ordinance. Happily, most cities are real veterans at adopting ordinances and doing the proper notices and publication and so on and so forth. So we don't have open meetings law based successful challenges very often. However, any violations we do have always make big news. They're big, even alleged violations of the open meetings law always make front page. You know, it's very skeptical. We live in a time of great skepticism of institutions and distrust and not liking government's very fashionable. And so those kind of stories are good news stories for the newspapers. Both of these laws, I think, are pretty straightforward to avoid. They're pretty easy to avoid problems with most of the time. I've already said talk to your attorney a few times. Again, I'll close with this. I think that most of the time, if people have a basic understanding of the purposes of these laws and embrace that, there aren't problems under these laws. It has to be pretty egregious. Now, the open meetings law, you can be sued under that, and if you violated it, we pay their attorney's fees. So it's set up so that it's very inexpensive for somebody to sue you for an open meetings law violation. So that's yet another reason to be particularly careful with that. Any questions? Everybody's beaten into submission. Yes. The usual reference in the minutes to going into executive session will be at 5:20, Councilman Jones made a motion to go into executive session to discuss yada, 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 and giving the reasons therefore, yada, 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 and citing this statute, and you put all that in the minutes. And then there will be a blank, and then at such and such a date, such and such a time, the executive session concluded and the open meeting reconvened. And then the minutes will continue. Ordinarily, things in the reason you vote to go into executive session is to reach a consensus that the matters to be discussed in private are in the best interest of the town. It's in the best interest of the town to discuss them in private. I hope that's responsive to your question. I mean, then everything's private. Now, the board that goes into executive session may waive the privilege or waive the confidentiality of the executive session. Let's say they have a meeting and they tape it and all like they're supposed to. And at the end, it's like, well, there's nothing really revolutionary that we talked about in here. We'll make this thing public. That's their prerogative. I'm always advising people, it isn't just whether you're permitted to have an executive session, it's whether you need to have an executive session. Just because the law would allow you to do it, maybe the exigencies of the situation locally don't require it. There's a cost to having executive sessions. What happens in an executive session is way more fascinating to the people that aren't there. Most of the people that are there are bored stiff, and the people that aren't allowed to come in are endlessly fascinated by what they're missing. Yes. The question was, do you have to go back into an open meeting at the end of the executive session? No. Not in this. I mean, I've heard of all sorts of variations on this, where an executive session is continued to the next meeting and they reconvene in executive session and then come out in the next meeting. They don't actually recess one meeting and stuff. So lots of stuff like that is possible, okay, but very unusual. The usual thing is you have one or two things to talk about in executive session. You go in for half an hour, and come back out, all in the same meeting. Usually the stuff in an executive session doesn't require, the whole remainder of the meeting. Yes, I do. That's a really good question. Keeping in mind, you have to have told the person that you're going to talk about them. And if the executive session occurred after you told them that means that person was okay with them being discussed in private. Now, if there's an action that comes after the executive session, let's say you go into executive session to talk about the city manager. Do we like the city manager or not? Do we want to keep the city manager? So and what I always tell people is you're not allowed to take formal action in executive session, but everybody can count, right? So you go around the room and everybody says what they think and you're just making notes. And what you want to stay away from is let's see a show of hands. You don't want to do that kind of stuff in executive session. But then there's case law that says, and you were talking about coming out of the executive session, that says if you come out of the executive session and just, okay, I make a move to fire the city manager, and then everybody, 5 people vote or more to fire the city manager, there's a bunch of cases that say you're not allowed to rubber stamp a decision that was obviously already made in an executive session. And the way to avoid appearing to rubber stamp something is you have your discussion in executive session, and then you come out of executive session and people will say, I think the city manager has overstayed her time in our town, and I think it's time for a change. And I'm particularly annoyed about the work that was done on the skate park and the stormwater infrastructure. You give some reasons in the public meeting, in other words, and so I moved to terminate the contract. And then so-and-so says, well, I'm going to vote for that, and my reasons are blah, 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 blah. So if something is put on the record in the open meeting to support the decision, the cases say the public has a right to observe the decision being made and the reasons therefore, which is why you can't come out and just rubber stamp. So I hope that's responsive. You need to come out and do more than just vote. You have to explain to everybody, including the person the city manager in my example. I picked the hardest example, and the hardest example is where some sort of action comes shortly after the executive session, and there's a suspicion that the deal was cooked in the executive session, and you're just blessing it. That's one to watch out for. But if all you're doing in executive session is talking about something, then no, that's what you're supposed to do in executive session, talk about stuff. And you have no obligation to come out and tell anybody about it. Indeed, your obligation is not to tell people about it. That's what the vote was about. Anything else? Thank you all very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.